General Motors is dropping electric van production at its plant near London, Ontario. The automaker says decreased demand has pushed it to stop making the Bright Drop electric delivery van.
At exactly 6:17 a.m., something changed, though almost nobody noticed it at first. There was no press conference, no cameras lined up outside a government building, no emergency sitting of Parliament, no dramatic chyron scrolling across breakfast television. But deep inside Canada's trade enforcement system, a switch was quietly flipped. And once it was, one of the most powerful automakers in North America began losing millions of dollars every single day. For decades, General Motors had operated on a familiar assumption. Canada would react the way it always had: a carefully worded statement, expressions of disappointment, a request for dialogue, perhaps a symbolic protest, and then eventually acceptance. That assumption, built over years of predictable responses, turned out to be one of the most expensive miscalculations the company has made in a generation. Because this time, Canada didn't ask, it enforced. The chain reaction didn't begin in Ottawa. It started in a corporate boardroom where balance sheets mattered more than human fallout. GM quietly shut down electric delivery van production at its facility in Ingersoll, Ontario. There was no phased transition, no alternate production line announced, no serious consultation with workers, unions, or government officials. Just a brief notice that more than 1,200 people would no longer be needed. To GM executives, it was framed as a routine adjustment. Another EV program that hadn't scaled as fast as projected. Another market correction in an industry struggling with high interest rates, supply chain volatility, and slower than expected consumer adoption. On paper, it looked clean, rational, even prudent. On the ground, it was anything but. In Ingersoll, the announcement landed like an earthquake. Families who had reorganized their lives around stable, long-term employment suddenly faced a void. Workers who had stayed through recessions, supply chain collapses, and the pandemic were told, without ceremony, that the future they'd been promised no longer existed. Mortgages had been planned around those paychecks. City budgets had been structured around that plant. Training programs, infrastructure upgrades, and local businesses all revolved around one assumption: GM's electric future in Canada was permanent. The shutdown wasn't just a business decision, it was a rupture of trust. Historically, this is where the story would have followed a familiar script. Politicians would express concern, unions would protest, negotiations would stretch on. And eventually, the company would either receive concessions or quietly move on, absorbing minimal long-term consequences. Communities would adjust because they had no choice. But this time, the script changed. Behind the scenes, Canada wasn't drafting a bailout package or preparing a negotiation memo. There were no frantic calls offering incentives to lure GM back. Instead, officials were opening a file most corporations barely remembered existed, because it had almost never been used. 3 days after the shutdown, the federal government released a statement so restrained it barely made headlines. It said GM had failed to meet its production commitments. No threats, no emotional language, no political theater. But inside Canada's trade framework, those words weren't commentary. They were a trigger. Canada had just activated its auto-remission enforcement mechanism. This system wasn't designed for debate. It wasn't built to pressure companies through public opinion or political shaming. It was engineered for something far more effective: automatic consequences. For decades, multinational automakers had relied on a simple formula: accept government incentives, promise long-term production and jobs, scale operations when convenient, and if conditions changed, quietly shift production elsewhere. Governments protested, workers paid the price, but real penalties were rare. Canada, after being burned repeatedly, decided to remove discretion from the equation. Within hours of activation, GM's duty-free import allowance into Canada was cut by exactly 24.2%. That number wasn't symbolic. It was calculated to mirror the production shortfall created by the Ingersoll shutdown, and its impact was immediate. Vehicles built in the United States, SUVs, trucks, crossovers, were suddenly subject to a 25% tariff the moment they crossed the Canadian border. Overnight, GM's pricing model collapsed. A vehicle that once sold comfortably at $45,000 now crossed $56,000 before taxes and fees. Dealerships froze. Sales teams scrambled for explanations they didn't have. Customers walked out. Inventory piled up. GM wasn't just less competitive, it was bleeding money with every shipment entering Canada. And this wasn't a temporary penalty. There was no built-in sunset clause, no political off-ramp. The tariffs would remain until Canada decided otherwise. The clock wasn't ticking in GM's favor. It wasn't ticking at all. That's when panic reached Detroit. Meetings that had been postponed for months suddenly became urgent. Emails that once sat unanswered were now flagged critical. Financial models ran nonstop, testing scenarios executives never imagined they'd need. And those models delivered a brutal conclusion. Reopening or repurposing production in Canada might actually be cheaper than absorbing permanent tariffs. The shockwaves didn't stop with GM. Across the industry, executives began reassessing assumptions that had governed North American manufacturing for decades. Stellantis, watching GM's situation deteriorate, quickly realized it wasn't immune. After shifting Jeep production to the United States, Canada responded the same way, cutting Stellantis' tariff-free quota in half. No negotiation, no warning, just enforcement. The message was unmistakable. Commitments were no longer optional. Market access was no longer guaranteed. And Canada was no longer willing to play the role of the polite junior partner. For the first time in a generation, corporations weren't threatening job losses to gain leverage. Canada was delivering consequences before those threats could even be made. Then came the deadline. Melanie Joly didn't deliver her message with raised voices or patriotic speeches. There was no spectacle, no grandstanding. She delivered it clinically, almost bureaucratically. GM had 15 days, not to negotiate, not to brainstorm alternatives, but to submit a complete, verifiable production plan for the Ingersoll facility. Model selection, timelines, supply chain integration, workforce commitments, everything. Fail to deliver and the tariffs would become permanent. Not for a year. Not until the next election. Permanent. Inside GM, irritation gave way to alarm. Strategy teams worked through nights, recalculating assumptions that had shaped North American manufacturing since the 1980s. Canada was no longer a low-risk jurisdiction where commitments could be revised without consequence. It was a market capable of imposing sustained economic pain, and willing to do so. And this confrontation wasn't happening in isolation. It was unfolding during one of the most unstable periods in Canada-US economic relations in years. Renewed tariff threats from Donald Trump had reintroduced volatility into cross-border trade. Negotiations swung from cooperative to hostile with little warning. Businesses struggled to plan long-term. Provinces struggled to forecast revenue. Public opinion shifted in ways policymakers couldn't ignore. Polls began showing something unprecedented. Canadians increasingly viewed the United States as a greater economic threat than China. That perception changed Ottawa's calculus. Rather than doubling down on dependence, Canada began quietly exploring leverage. Not alignment, not confrontation. Optionality. Diversification. Strategic room to maneuver. And in one of the most closely watched diplomatic moments in nearly a decade, Mark Carney sat down with Xi Jinping for the most substantive Canada-China dialogue in years. The signal wasn't subtle. Canada would not allow itself to be cornered by corporate pressure or geopolitical unpredictability, which meant GM had chosen the worst possible moment to test Canada's resolve. As the 15-day countdown ticked toward its final hours, the implications became impossible to ignore. This wasn't just about one plant. It wasn't even about one company. It was about power, who held it and who no longer did. For decades, workers absorbed the risk. Corporations moved freely. Governments accommodated. Communities adapted. That equation had quietly governed North American manufacturing for half a century. Now it had flipped. The families in Ingersoll, the single mother staring at an uncertain mortgage, the father who had worked overtime to put his children through school, were no longer collateral damage. They had become the line Canada decided corporations could not cross. Whether GM ultimately restores production, restructures its Canadian footprint, or absorbs the losses, one reality is already locked in. The old relationship between Canada and American automakers is over. Subsidies without enforcement are finished. Promises without consequences no longer carry weight. GM believed it could walk away quietly. Canada made sure the cost of doing so would echo across the continent. Because when a country stops asking and starts enforcing, the balance of North American manufacturing shifts. And if this is how Canada responds to one broken commitment, the message to every multinational corporation is unmistakable. The era of polite disappointment is over. This is the era of accountability.